What if the Spanish Armada had crushed England? The year is 1588. The seas between Spain and England boil with cannon fire. Smoke rises over the channel, and waves crash against burning timbers. The fate of nations balances on the wind. Imagine, just for a moment, if the storm had not favored England. If the guns of the Armada had torn through the Royal Navy. If Spain had crushed its heretic rival and claimed the throne of Elizabeth. What if the Spanish Armada had won? Would the world of today still belong to us? Or would it belong to Spain? Europe in the second half of the 16th century was a land of fear, faith, and fire. The Protestant Reformation had split the continent like a great wound. In the South, Catholic monarchs stood armored in tradition, devoted to Rome, and determined to defend the supremacy of the Church. In the North, Protestant rulers pushed against centuries of orthodoxy, eager to break the Pope's grip on kings and nations. Nowhere was this clash sharper than across the stormy waters of the English Channel, where two monarchs, Philip II of Spain and Elizabeth I of England, stared at one another with mutual hatred. Philip was not merely a king, he was the sovereign of the first truly global empire. His realm stretched from the sun-baked plains of Castile to the green hills of Naples, from the Low Countries to the silver mountains of Peru. Every year, treasure fleets crossed the Atlantic under the flag of Castile, bringing tons of silver from the mines of Potosí and Zacatecas. This flood of wealth turned Spain into the richest and most powerful state in Europe. Its armies, drilled into the famous Spanish tercios, were considered invincible. Its fleets were vast, disciplined, and commanded by men who believed they carried the mission of God himself. But despite his power, Philip was haunted. He saw England as a dagger pointed at his empire's heart. Elizabeth had broken with the Catholic Church, defied papal authority, and declared herself the supreme governor of a new Protestant Church of England. To Philip, this was not only blasphemy, it was rebellion against God. Worse still, Elizabeth gave shelter to Protestant rebels from the Netherlands, men who fought against Philip's rule in the Low Countries. She encouraged English privateers, men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, to plunder Spanish treasure ships on the high seas. These sea dogs were little more than pirates, but to Philip, they were state-sponsored heretics draining the lifeblood of his empire. The political rivalry was made personal by blood and faith. Once, Elizabeth had been courted as a bride for Philip after the death of her sister, Queen Mary Tudor, who had briefly married the Spanish monarch. That union had tied England to Spain in Catholic devotion, but Mary's death and Elizabeth's rise severed the bond. Elizabeth's refusal to return to the Catholic fold, her flirtation with Protestant suitors, and her excommunication by the Pope in 1570 all marked her as an enemy of the Catholic world. For Philip, defeating Elizabeth was not just politics, it was a holy crusade. And yet, across England, the mood was grim. The kingdom was small compared to Spain. Its population numbered perhaps 4 million souls, less than a third of Spain's. Its economy was fragile, reliant on wool exports and thin streams of taxation. Militarily, it was weak. England had no great standing army, relying instead on militias drawn from local shires. Its navy, though spirited, was far smaller than Spain's. Few in London doubted what would happen if the mighty tercios ever landed on English soil. Still, England possessed something Spain did not: a growing spirit of defiance and a new vision of the world. Elizabeth and her counselors knew they could never match Spain in wealth or soldiers, but they believed they could outmaneuver it at sea. The English Navy had begun to experiment with lighter, faster ships, armed with heavy guns that could batter enemies from a distance rather than closing for boarding actions. This new style of naval warfare was risky, but innovative. It would soon prove decisive. By the 1580s, the conflict between the two kingdoms had escalated to the breaking point. In 1587, Elizabeth authorized Francis Drake to strike Cadiz, destroying dozens of Spanish ships and delaying Philip's invasion plans. But the blow was only temporary. Philip continued his preparations for what he called the Enterprise of England. Across Spanish shipyards, carpenters hammered night and day. constructing one of the largest fleets Europe had ever seen. More than 130 ships, carrying over 30,000 men, were assembled. They were to sail from Spain, link up with Parma's army in the Netherlands, and ferry those hardened troops across the Channel. Once in England, the plan was simple: overthrow Elizabeth, crush Protestantism, and restore Catholic rule. The scale of the Armada was breathtaking. Galleons bristling with cannon, towering naos laden with supplies, nimble galleasses designed to smash enemy formations. It was a floating city of war. Priests were assigned to every vessel, declaring the venture a holy mission. To Philip and his admirals, victory seemed inevitable. How could a small island kingdom resist the wrath of the world's most powerful empire? And yet, in the taverns of London and the halls of Whitehall, whispers spread that perhaps God favored Elizabeth. Perhaps the island's isolation was not a weakness, but a shield. Perhaps the new naval tactics, untested though they were, might stand against the Spanish tide. The fate of England, and perhaps of the entire Reformation, would soon be decided on the waves. Europe held its breath. The summer of 1588 was approaching, and with it the storm of history. Would England fall back into the Catholic fold, or would it rise against the greatest empire of its age? That question hung over every king, every court, every soldier. And as the Armada prepared to sail, the world prepared to change forever. To truly grasp the stakes of the coming storm, we must peel back the veil and see Europe not as a collection of kingdoms, but as a battlefield of faith, power, and ambition. The year 1588 was not simply a year of warships. It was the culmination of a struggle for the soul of the continent. The Protestant Reformation had already carved deep fractures into Christendom. In Germany, princes had broken from Rome. In Scandinavia, Lutheran monarchs ruled. In Geneva, Calvinists preached a stark vision of faith and discipline, but in the South, Catholicism still reigned supreme, anchored by Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy itself. These worlds were not content to coexist. Each saw the other as a mortal enemy. Spain stood at the very center of Catholic might. Fueled by the silver rivers of the New World, Philip II commanded an empire so vast that his officials boasted the sun never set upon it. This was no empty phrase. From the Philippines and Asia to the Caribbean, from Mexico to Peru, from Milan to the Low Countries, Spain's authority stretched farther than that of any ruler before him. The wealth extracted from colonies funded the largest standing army in Europe, the dreaded tercios. These were not common levies or peasant recruits. They were professionals, drilled to fight in tight pike squares, their discipline legendary. Against them, few armies could stand for long. Yet Spain's strength also carried burdens. The Low Countries, fiercely Protestant in their northern provinces, had risen against Spanish rule decades earlier. For years, Philip's soldiers bled in Dutch towns and fields, trying to stamp out rebellion. Elizabeth of England had thrown her support behind these rebels, providing money, weapons, and even troops under the Earl of Leicester. For Philip, this was intolerable. The English were not only defying Catholic orthodoxy at home, they were exporting heresy abroad, undermining his dominion in the Netherlands and threatening the lifeline of Spanish trade routes through the Channel. To strike England was to strike at the very heart of Protestant resistance. If England could be subdued, the Dutch would stand alone, isolated and crushed. France, torn by its own religious wars, was unlikely to intervene decisively. The Holy Roman Emperor remained loyal to Rome. Without England, the Protestant cause across Europe might wither and die. This was not merely a dynastic war. It was an apocalyptic struggle. Both sides believed that if they lost, God's plan for the world itself would be rewritten. England, meanwhile, was a nation of contradictions. On the one hand, it was vulnerable, small, underpopulated, with no great treasury to rival Spain's endless silver. Its defenses on land were pitiful, a patchwork of militias more suited to fending off raiders than confronting veteran tercios. Its nobility was divided. Many lords outwardly served Elizabeth, but in their hearts remained Catholic, waiting to see if Spain's victory might restore their faith to prominence. A successful Spanish landing might not even require a prolonged war. One decisive blow could topple Elizabeth's fragile Protestant settlement and bring half the nobility rushing to Philip's side. On the other hand, England possessed assets not visible on parchment. Its island geography was both shield and sword. The Channel was a barrier no invader could easily cross, a moat that demanded naval mastery. And here, Elizabeth's admirals hoped to outwit their enemies. The English fleet was smaller, yes, but built for agility. Their ships could dance across the waves, striking with long-range cannon, refusing the slow, grinding embraces that Spanish boarding tactics required. Men like Francis Drake had honed these methods not in royal service alone, but as privateers, raiding Spanish shipping across the Atlantic. They were pirates elevated to patriots, hardened by years of fighting Spain with meager resources. In the royal court at Whitehall, debates raged. Could England truly resist the might of Spain? Some whispered of negotiation, of reaching out for peace before the Armada set sail. Others argued that resistance was a matter of survival. If Elizabeth bent the knee, England would become a vassal of Rome once more, its independence smothered. Elizabeth herself projected calm defiance, famously declaring she would rather face invasion than betray her faith and her people. Yet even she must have felt the gnawing dread of reality, for this was the truth. If the Armada succeeded, the story of England might end. Its fledgling navy destroyed, its queen deposed, its Reformation strangled at birth. The cultural flowering that would give the world Shakespeare and the King James Bible would never come to pass. The very idea of an English empire beyond the seas would dissolve before it ever began. The summer of 1588 was therefore a moment of unbearable tension. In Spain's shipyards, carpenters hammered planks, priests blessed the fleet, and soldiers sharpened pikes. In England's taverns, rumors of invasion spread like wildfire. Farmers and fishermen were drilled as militia, knowing in their hearts they could not hope to match the seasoned tercios. Across Europe, rulers watched and waited. Some prayed for Spain's victory, others for England's survival. But all understood that the outcome would reshape the continent for generations. The world stood on the edge of a knife. And as the Armada prepared to depart, one question loomed like thunderclouds over the Channel. When the storm broke, which faith, which empire, and which vision of the future would emerge triumphant? The Armada was not merely a fleet. It was a statement of destiny. Philip II believed that God himself had chosen Spain to be the hammer of heresy, and the Armada was his instrument. In the spring of 1588, after years of preparation, the greatest concentration of naval power Europe had yet seen gathered in the ports of Spain and Portugal. More than 130 ships, from towering galleons to smaller support vessels, bristled with cannon and carried supplies for months of war. On board waited nearly 30,000 men, sailors hardened by Atlantic crossings, soldiers drilled in the tactics of the tercios, priests ready to hear confessions and deliver blessings before battle. Command was given to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a man of noble birth but limited naval experience. He was not Philip's first choice. Others had died, fallen ill, or proven reluctant to shoulder such an enormous burden. Sidonia himself confessed doubts in private letters, admitting he was no sailor and feared the enormity of the task. But Philip was not interested in excuses. The king's orders were absolute. Sidonia would lead the Armada north, sweep aside the English fleet, and rendezvous with the Duke of Parma in the Netherlands. Parma commanded some 30,000 crack troops, veterans of the Dutch wars, waiting in readiness to be ferried across the Channel. Once united, the two forces would land in Kent or Essex, march on London, and overthrow Elizabeth. The plan was ambitious, even audacious, but not impossible. Spain's strength lay in the coordination of overwhelming force. The Armada itself was not designed to land troops. It was a shield, a floating fortress meant to protect Parma's soldiers during the crossing. If Sidonia could secure the Channel long enough, England would face the nightmare it most dreaded: Spanish boots on English soil. In London, Elizabeth and her counselors knew the peril. Spies and informants reported the Armada's mustering. Rumors swirled of invasion fleets larger than any seen since antiquity. The English crown scrambled to prepare. Militia levies were raised in every shire, though most lacked weapons and training. Fortifications were strengthened around London, but it was the navy that bore the true weight of the kingdom's survival. At the head of this defense stood men like Lord Charles Howard of Effingham, commander of the fleet, and his brilliant vice-admiral, Sir Francis Drake. Drake was no ordinary officer. He was a corsair, a man who had circumnavigated the globe, plundered Spain's colonies, and returned with treasure beyond imagining. To the Spanish, he was El Draque, the dragon, a figure of terror. To the English, he was a national hero, living proof that daring and cunning could humble even the mightiest empire. The English strategy was shaped by necessity. They could not hope to match Spain ship for ship, nor could they fight in the close quarters grappling and boarding actions where Spanish soldiers excelled. Instead, they placed their faith in speed, maneuver, and firepower. English ships, like the race-built galleons, were lean, low in the water, and armed with heavy, long-range guns. Their crews were drilled to fire, reload, and fire again, keeping enemies at bay rather than rushing in to board. If Spain fought like armored knights of the sea, England would fight like skirmishers, darting in and out, striking from a distance. Still, the odds were terrifying. England's fleet numbered around 200 vessels, but many were small merchant ships hastily armed for war. Only a fraction matched the size and power of Spain's galleons. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition was limited. And above all, the English knew that if the Armada succeeded in escorting Parma's army across, no amount of naval bravery would matter. The tercios on land were unstoppable. The stage was set for a clash of worlds. On one side, the richest empire Europe had ever known, armed with the blessings of the Pope and the wealth of the New World. On the other, a fragile island kingdom, desperate, defiant, fighting for survival. Both sides believed Providence was on their side. Philip spoke of a holy mission, a crusade to bring England back to the Catholic fold. Elizabeth invoked the image of herself as a shepherdess of her people, ready to stand among them in battle, declaring that, though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she possessed the heart and stomach of a king. The summer sun rose over the Bay of Biscay as the Armada unfurled its sails. The sea itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of so many timbers. Villagers watched from the shore as the horizon filled with masts, like a forest drifting across the waves. Trumpets blared, priests intoned prayers, and banners bearing the cross of Burgundy snapped in the wind. Europe watched in awe. Never before had such a fleet set forth. And yet, beneath the grandeur, fate twisted its threads. Storms lashed the Armada as it sailed, scattering ships, damaging rigging, delaying its progress. Sidonia struggled to maintain cohesion. Supplies dwindled. By the time the Armada reached the Channel, it was already battered by the elements. But it still possessed enormous power. If it could link with Parma, the invasion would proceed. Here, history teeters on its knife edge. For in our world, English harassment, daring fireships, and the fury of the weather broke the Armada. The Spanish failed to unite with Parma, retreated north, and limped home in ruin. England was saved, and the balance of Europe tilted forever. But imagine, what if fortune had turned? What if the winds had been kinder, the fireships ineffective, the English gunnery less precise? What if Medina Sidonia had swept aside his doubts and seized his chance? The Armada might have triumphed. Parma's troops might have crossed. The conquest of England might have begun. And in that single possibility lies the unraveling of the world we know. The moment the Spanish tercios set foot on English soil would have been like thunder rolling across the heavens. For decades, England had lived under the illusion of safety, shielded by the waters of the Channel. Now that shield was broken. The Armada, battered but victorious, had secured the passage. Parma's barges ferried veterans across the narrow sea, men who had fought in Flanders, in Italy, in every corner of Philip's sprawling empire. These were no frightened levies drawn from farm and village. They were Europe's most feared soldiers, drilled in formations that had shattered the might of France and humbled the Turks. Their boots striking the beaches of Kent would have echoed like a funeral march for Protestant England. Imagine the panic in London. Word would spread faster than the wind. The Spaniards have landed. Along the southern roads, peasants would abandon their fields, crowding into towns already swollen with refugees. Church bells would toll not in celebration, but in dread. The militias summoned by Elizabeth's lieutenants would stumble into their ranks, some armed with rusty pikes, others with nothing but farm tools. They were brave, yes, but bravery could not stop the steel wall of the tercios. Elizabeth's court would be thrown into turmoil. Her counselors, already divided, would split into factions, some urging immediate flight to the north, others demanding the Queen stand and inspire her people. Catholic nobles, long simmering in resentment, would see the invasion as an opportunity. Whispers of defection would ripple through the aristocracy. Would these lords truly raise their swords for a Protestant queen excommunicated by Rome? Or would they seize the chance to restore their lands, their faith, and their influence by pledging loyalty to Spain? The psychological weight of the invasion cannot be overstated. For generations, England's sense of destiny had rested on its insularity, its separation from the endless wars of the continent. Now that separation was shattered, Spanish banners flew not across the Channel, but within sight of London. The fear of annihilation would press on every heart. Would Elizabeth herself be captured? Executed? Forced into exile? Europe would wait to see whether the Virgin Queen became a martyr or a memory. But for Philip and his commanders, this was not merely conquest. It was redemption. The Pope had blessed the Armada as a holy mission, a crusade to extinguish heresy at its root. Spanish priests marched alongside soldiers, carrying crucifixes and relics, declaring that God's justice had finally descended upon England. Each village subdued, each castle taken, would be framed not only as a military victory, but as a divine purification. The English resistance, such as it was, would be fragmented. In the south, militias would crumble before professional soldiers. In the north, where Catholic sentiment remained strong, uprisings might erupt in favor of the invaders. Elizabeth's most loyal commanders would fight with courage, Drake perhaps still harrying Spanish supply lines at sea, the Earl of Leicester attempting to rally what forces he could. But without control of the Channel, their efforts would be in vain. Every day that Spain held its foothold, more troops would cross, more supplies would flow, until England was suffocated by overwhelming force. Consider the symbolism: Spanish standards rising over Dover Castle, priests conducting Mass in Canterbury Cathedral, the Tower of London seized by foreign soldiers. These would not be temporary occupations. They would be statements to the world that England's Protestant experiment was over. The young Church of England, barely 2 generations old, would be crushed before it could take root. And the repercussions would radiate outward. Across the Channel, the Dutch rebels would despair. Their most valuable ally was gone, their lifeline severed. Without English ports, without English gold, their cause would wither. The Protestant Reformation itself would falter, isolated in the northern fringes of Europe. In France, torn by religious wars, Catholic forces would gain new confidence, emboldened by Spain's triumph. Even the German princes, once defiant, might bow once more to the authority of Rome. For England, the occupation would mean not only military defeat, but cultural transformation. Spanish officials would govern from London. The Inquisition, perhaps in softer form, would root out Protestant preachers. English Bibles would be seized and burned. Public worship would be returned to Latin. A puppet monarch, perhaps chosen from Catholic claimants, would be crowned in Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth herself might vanish into legend, remembered as the last Protestant queen of a fallen realm. Yet even in this grim picture, resistance would smolder. Bands of English loyalists might retreat into forests and hills, waging guerrilla war. Protestant exiles might flee to Scotland or the continent, plotting return. But the truth was simple. Without naval supremacy, without allies, their struggle would be hopeless. England's fate would no longer be its own. History trembles at this possibility. For in the landing of Spanish troops lies the unraveling of centuries. No Shakespeare, no King James Bible, no expansion into the New World under English sails. The island that in our world became an empire would instead become a province, absorbed, humbled, reshaped by Spain's will. And as the smoke of burning villages rose into the summer sky, the question would no longer be whether England survived, but what kind of world would emerge from its ashes. The thunder of invasion shook England to its core. The Spanish tercios, once legends whispered across Europe, were now flesh and blood on English soil. They advanced in perfect squares, pikes bristling like iron forests, muskets flashing in disciplined volleys. Against them, England's militias shattered like waves upon rock. Farmers armed with scythes, villagers clutching rusty swords, townsmen who had never seen battle, all were swept aside by the professional machine of Spain. The fields of Kent and Essex, green and gentle in spring, were churned into killing grounds. Smoke from burning villages curled into the sky, visible for miles, as the Armada's victory turned into occupation. Naval clashes still raged in the Channel, but the English fleet was broken, scattered, and starved of ports. Drake and his captains fought with desperate brilliance, but their galleons could no longer harry the Spanish supply lines effectively. Without safe harbor, every maneuver risked annihilation. Spain's heavy ships, reinforced and shielded by Parma's transports, pressed their advantage. The Channel, the lifeline of English survival, was closed. The invaders had achieved the one thing England could never allow: control of the sea. In London, terror reigned. Refugees poured in from the south, bringing tales of massacre and Spanish banners flying above castles. The Queen's councillors debated in panic. Some urged Elizabeth to flee north, to rally Scotland, and perhaps seek aid from Protestant allies on the continent. Others whispered surrender, arguing that resistance would only bring the Inquisition's wrath upon the people. Elizabeth herself, proud and unbending, tried to project the same defiance she had shown at Tilbury in our history. But even her stirring words could not disguise the truth. The heart of England was exposed. Politically, the kingdom fractured. Catholic nobles came out of hiding, declaring allegiance to Spain. Secret networks of recusants, long punished under Elizabeth's rule, rose in rebellion, seizing estates and castles in the name of the old faith. The Spanish commanders exploited these divisions skillfully, promising protection and restoration of lands to those who bent the knee. For many lords, survival outweighed loyalty. Within weeks, large swaths of the South recognized Philip as their overlord, while Elizabeth's loyalists dwindled to isolated strongholds. On the battlefield, the contrast between the two sides was stark. The tercios fought like a machine, drilled to perfection after decades of war. Musketeers fired in rolling sequences, reloading behind the shield of pikes. Cavalry struck with precision, breaking militia lines and scattering peasants. Against them, England's levies had courage but little else. They lacked artillery, discipline, and coordination. Time and again they were driven back, leaving corpses to mark their stand. Resistance became less a battle than a slaughter. Yet the conquest was not bloodless for Spain. The English countryside proved hostile. Supplies were scarce, roads poor, and villages often emptied before the soldiers arrived. Guerrilla attacks harried foraging parties. Bands of Protestant loyalists struck by night, ambushing stragglers and burning wagons. Spanish discipline was harsh but not infinite. Every ambush, every raid, fed resentment among the occupiers. Priests spoke of God's favor, but soldiers muttered of endless skirmishes in a land that refused to submit fully. Still, the strategic picture was clear. Spain held the south. The Armada patrolled the Channel. Parma's reinforcements crossed steadily. The rebellion in the Netherlands began to falter, its lifeline to England cut. Dutch envoys pleaded with Elizabeth for aid, but she had none to give. With English resources drained, the Protestant cause across Europe flickered like a candle in the wind. In France, Catholic factions gained confidence, pressing harder against their Protestant rivals. The dominoes began to fall. For Philip, the invasion was not just a victory, but a signal to all of Europe. Resistance was futile. Rome declared the conquest a triumph of faith. Bells rang in Madrid, Seville, and Naples. Poets and priests proclaimed that God had chosen Spain as his sword. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the Catholic world might be reunited. Protestantism strangled before it could reach maturity. But even as Philip's banners rose in England, questions lingered. Could Spain truly hold the island long term? Could an empire already stretched across continents afford the endless cost of occupation? Would Elizabeth rally allies from Scotland, or would the northern lords betray her as the southern ones had? The victory, overwhelming though it appeared, opened new uncertainties. What was certain was this: the age of English independence was over. The naval daring that might have carried English sails to America was cut short. The cultural flowering of Shakespeare's age was smothered under Spanish censorship, and the dream of a Protestant empire beyond the seas dissolved into smoke. The battle for England had been decided, but the war for Europe's soul was only beginning. And in that broader struggle, the consequences of the Armada's triumph would ripple outward, reshaping the destiny of nations yet unborn. With England subdued, the ripple of Spain's triumph spread outward across oceans and centuries. The consequences were not merely political, but civilizational. The fall of Elizabeth's realm meant the suffocation of ideas and ambitions that, in our world, reshaped the planet. Now those seeds of empire and revolution were never planted. The most immediate impact was colonial. In our history, Elizabeth's reign marked the beginning of England's tentative overseas ventures. Raleigh dreamed of Virginia, Drake circumnavigated the globe, and merchants spoke of tapping into the wealth of Asia. But under Spanish domination, those dreams withered. The Armada's victory chained England to Catholic orthodoxy and Spanish hegemony. No Jamestown, no Plymouth, no Virginia Company. The New World, instead of becoming a contested arena of English, French, and Dutch exploration, remained firmly within the grasp of Iberia. Spain and Portugal, bound by the Treaty of Tordesillas, already divided the world between them. With England neutralized and the Dutch rebellion collapsing, few challengers remained. France, racked by its own wars of religion, was too weak to contest Spain's supremacy at sea. The balance of colonial power tilted decisively. From Mexico to Peru, from the Caribbean to the Philippines, Spain's monopoly solidified. The English-speaking presence in North America vanished before it could begin. The great cities of the American East, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, never rose from wilderness. Instead, Spanish and perhaps French colonies spread deeper into the continent, their languages dominating, their institutions shaping futures that in our world were Anglo-Protestant. But conquest altered more than geography. It reshaped culture and faith. The Reformation, already embattled, suffered a crushing blow. The Dutch, deprived of their ally across the Channel, faced the relentless might of Spanish armies. One by one, their cities would fall, their leaders captured or killed. Protestantism would survive only in the northernmost reaches of Europe, in Scandinavia and a few German principalities. Elsewhere, Catholic orthodoxy reasserted itself with renewed vigor. Rome, triumphant, proclaimed the Armada's victory as proof of divine will. The Counter-Reformation surged forward, its message uncompromising. God had chosen his champion, and that champion was Spain. The cultural consequences inside England were equally profound. Elizabeth's fragile religious settlement was torn apart. The Book of Common Prayer, the King James Bible that in our world followed a generation later, never existed. Shakespeare, if he wrote at all, would have written under censorship. His plays reshaped to glorify Catholic virtue and royal obedience. The vibrant flowering of English literature, philosophy, and theater, so essential to the modern English identity, was extinguished or twisted to serve the conqueror's narrative. The English language, rather than expanding across the globe, might have remained provincial, overshadowed by the triumphant Spanish tongue. Economically, the implications were immense. England's merchants, once dreaming of new markets, would be absorbed into Spain's system. The silver of the Americas would not fund English ventures, but reinforce Spain's dominance. Trade routes through the Atlantic, instead of being contested, became highways of Iberian monopoly. The seeds of capitalism, nurtured in London's merchant houses, would never grow into the global system that later underpinned the Industrial Revolution. Without England's push for free trade and naval dominance, Europe's economic trajectory tilted toward a slower, more centralized model under Catholic monarchs. Politically, the very idea of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary power suffered. Elizabeth's survival in our world allowed the English crown to evolve into a system where Parliament gained strength, where limits on royal authority became entrenched, and where notions of liberty began to germinate. Under Spanish domination, that path was severed. England became a client kingdom, its ruler chosen by Philip and sanctioned by the Pope. The Inquisition, if not fully transplanted, nonetheless cast its shadow. Dissent was crushed, uniformity enforced. The English people, once on the cusp of defining a new vision of governance, were dragged back into the orbit of absolutism. Globally, the timeline bent. Without England's naval expansion, there was no Royal Navy to rise as Spain's great rival. The seas remained dominated by Iberian fleets. Centuries later, when revolutions began to stir in the colonies, they would erupt not in 13 English settlements along the Atlantic coast, but in Spanish viceroyalties. The American Revolution never existed. The United States was never born. The arsenal of democracy that in our history reshaped the 20th century simply did not come to be. The language of freedom, of checks and balances, of representative government did not spread from London to Philadelphia, from Philadelphia to the world. Instead, the heartbeat of modernity slowed, its rhythm dictated by kings and priests rather than by parliaments and peoples. And yet, victory carried its own seeds of weakness. Spain's empire was vast, but it was brittle. The cost of occupying England would strain its treasury further, its silver already feeding inflation. The tercios, though mighty, were stretched thin across continents. But for the moment, in the afterglow of the Armada's triumph, such cracks were invisible. What mattered to the world was clear. Spain had not only crushed its greatest enemy, but reshaped the very balance of civilization. The question was no longer whether Protestantism would survive, but whether the ideas it carried, resistance to authority, freedom of conscience, the spark of innovation, would vanish with it. Europe stood at a crossroads, and in this alternate world, the road ahead was lit not by the flame of English defiance, but by the stern light of Catholic Spain. The conquest of England was not a single blow, but a grinding storm. Even as Spanish banners rose over Dover and Canterbury, the island refused to submit quietly. Resistance, though fractured and desperate, flared across the countryside. Villages loyal to Elizabeth armed themselves with whatever tools they could find, pikes, bows, even sharpened farm implements, and struck at isolated Spanish patrols. At night, the forests echoed with ambushes. By day, smoke curled from estates set ablaze in scorched earth defiance. England might have been beaten, but it was not yet broken. The Spanish tercios answered with ruthless efficiency. Their commanders understood the danger of guerrilla war, and they struck hard to extinguish it. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned to the ground, their populations scattered or enslaved. Priests declared such punishments the will of God, warning that to resist Philip's authority was to resist heaven itself. Yet each act of suppression only fed the fury of the people. For every hamlet destroyed, another rose in anger. The land itself became hostile, a maze of hedgerows and rivers where ambushes lurked behind every tree. Still, on the battlefield, Spain's superiority was undeniable. At Maidstone, a militia force attempted to block the road north. Armed with pikes and a few outdated cannon, they faced a tercio column advancing with grim precision. The clash was brief and terrible. Spanish musketeers fired in coordinated volleys, cutting swaths through English lines. Cavalry thundered into the flanks, scattering peasants in terror. When the smoke cleared, the field was littered with bodies, and the road to London lay open. Word of the massacre spread like wildfire. Fear turned to despair. In London itself, the atmosphere grew suffocating. The Thames carried stories of disaster upstream, while refugees choked the city gates. Elizabeth's council fractured further. Some urged the Queen to rally what remained of her armies in the north, perhaps to unite with Scottish allies. Others whispered that flight across the sea, to Denmark, or even Protestant Sweden, was the only hope. The Queen, proud to the last, refused to abandon her capital. She appeared in armor before her remaining troops, echoing the words she had spoken at Tilbury in another history. She declared she had the heart and stomach of a king. But her defiance, though stirring, could not halt the tide of Spanish steel. The Armada's grip on the seas ensured the flow of reinforcements. Parma's veterans continued to cross the Channel, their numbers swelling by the week. England was being strangled not only on land but from the sea itself. The once proud English navy, battered and starving of supplies, could do little but harass at the edges. Drake, that old sea-wolf, struck daring raids on isolated transports, but each victory was costly and unsustainable. Without secure ports, his fleet dwindled. The dragon that had once terrified Spain was now reduced to a shadow, hunted across the waters he once ruled. Politically, Spain moved swiftly to consolidate its conquest. Catholic nobles were rewarded with power, their estates restored. Protestant leaders were hunted down, their printing presses smashed, their congregations driven underground. The message was clear. England was no longer a Protestant kingdom, but a Catholic possession. Mass was restored in cathedrals, and inquisitors began their work in London. A puppet monarch, perhaps an English Catholic claimant or a Spanish viceroy, was prepared to take the throne under Philip's blessing. Yet the occupation strained even Spain's formidable resources. Supplying an army across the Channel was costly. English winters were harsher than Castilian generals expected. Disease spread in camps, and resistance fighters struck supply trains. The tercios won every open battle, but they could not kill the English spirit. Instead, they ruled through fear, crucifix, and sword entwined. Europe watched with bated breath. In the Netherlands, Protestant rebels faltered, their hopes dimming with every English defeat. In France, Catholic factions rejoiced, while Huguenots despaired. The Reformation teetered on the edge of collapse. Spain seemed unstoppable, its empire stretching from the Andes to the Thames. And yet, beneath the triumphant surface, cracks began to show. Philip's treasury bled silver at an unsustainable rate. His soldiers, stretched across continents, groaned under the endless burden. But none of this mattered to the terrified people of England in that fateful summer. For them, each day brought new horrors. Executions in the squares, Spanish patrols marching through cobbled streets, the sound of foreign tongues in their own marketplaces. The land that once dreamed of ruling the seas was now a conquered province. And yet the question lingered like smoke over the battlefield. Could Spain hold what it had taken, or would the fire of resistance one day reignite into something greater? The answer would shape not only England's future, but the destiny of the entire world. The fall of England reverberated like an earthquake across the continent. For centuries afterward, historians in this alternate world would mark 1588 not only as the year of the Armada, but as the moment the course of civilization veered in an entirely new direction. Spain, triumphant, stood astride Europe like a colossus. Elizabeth's crown was shattered, her Protestant experiment extinguished. In Westminster Abbey, under banners of crimson and gold, a Catholic monarch was enthroned, chosen with the blessing of Philip II and sanctioned by the Pope. England was no longer an independent Protestant power. It was a client of Madrid, a jewel set into the diadem of Spain's global empire. The immediate consequences were devastating for the Protestant cause. The Dutch, already pressed hard in their long revolt, lost their greatest ally. Without English ports and subsidies, the rebellion collapsed. City after city fell back into Spanish hands. Antwerp, once defiant, surrendered under crushing siege. The dream of a free Dutch republic, that beacon of religious tolerance and mercantile innovation, never came to fruition. The Reformation, so vibrant only decades before, shrank into the cold north of Europe. In Denmark, Sweden, and scattered German principalities, Protestantism survived like a flickering candle. Elsewhere, it was suffocated under the weight of Catholic reconquest. Culturally, the consequences were no less profound. In London, the theaters were silenced or transformed. Shakespeare, if he survived the upheaval at all, wrote not for the glory of Elizabeth's court, but under the censorship of Spanish overseers. His plays might have praised Catholic virtue, celebrated obedience to monarchy, and condemned the chaos of heresy. The English Renaissance, the flourishing of art, poetry, and drama that in our timeline gave birth to a global language, was shackled. English literature became provincial, a minor tongue overshadowed by the universal dominance of Spanish. Across the Atlantic and the Pacific, from Lima to Manila, Spanish already reigned. Now, the language would smother England as well, pushing it to the margins of world culture. The sciences, too, suffered. In our world, the Protestant nations fostered an environment of questioning and experimentation. Francis Bacon, Newton, and generations of thinkers pushed the boundaries of knowledge. But in a Spain-dominated England, such inquiry found little fertile soil. The Inquisition, if not fully transplanted, nonetheless hovered over intellectual life. Heresy was a dangerous charge, and too much curiosity could be deemed rebellion. Scientific revolution slowed, philosophy lagged, and Europe's path toward modernity dimmed. Politically, the triumph of Spain reinforced absolutism. The delicate balance between monarchy and parliament, which in our world evolved into a model of limited constitutional government, was severed. Under Spanish guidance, parliament was neutered, its authority curtailed. The traditions of Magna Carta and common law endured only as empty echoes. Instead, England became another arm of Spain's centralized, hierarchical system. Liberty, of conscience, of speech, of governance, was sacrificed on the altar of unity. Economically, Spain's victory consolidated its global monopoly. The Atlantic was no longer a contested space. English merchants, once daring explorers, were absorbed into Spain's networks or crushed outright. The Caribbean became an Iberian lake, its trade tightly controlled. The North American coast remained barren of English colonies. Jamestown, Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay were never founded. Instead, Spanish and French settlers extended their dominions, spreading Catholic institutions deep into the interior. The United States, that future titan of democracy and industry, never emerged. The world's most influential experiment in self-government was strangled before birth. For France, the Armada's triumph was both opportunity and peril. Freed from the threat of an ambitious England, France expanded cautiously in North America, but always under Spain's shadow. On the continent, the French crown had to reckon with a Spain more powerful than ever. French Protestants, the Huguenots, were crushed with renewed vigor, their hopes extinguished. France remained Catholic, authoritarian, and entangled in Spanish orbit. The delicate rivalry that in our timeline balanced Europe tilted heavily toward Madrid. Globally, the effect was staggering. The English language never spread beyond the British Isles, confined and diminished under Catholic rule. Spanish, already spoken across 2 continents, became the unrivaled lingua franca of the early modern world. The Enlightenment, delayed and reshaped, emerged not in London coffeehouses or Dutch universities, but cautiously in Paris and Madrid, filtered through the lens of Catholic orthodoxy. Progress still came, but it came slower, more carefully, more constrained. The Industrial Revolution, if it emerged at all, was postponed for generations. And yet, beneath Spain's apparent invincibility, seeds of decline were already sown. The cost of occupation was immense. Feeding armies across the Channel drained Philip's coffers, even as silver from the New World flooded Europe and fueled inflation. Resistance in England, though suppressed, never fully died. Secret Protestant networks carried on underground, spreading tracts and whispers of freedom. Exiled nobles plotted abroad. Even in victory, Spain's grip was brittle, but for the moment, none of this mattered. What mattered was the new order. Protestantism was broken, England was fallen, Spain stood supreme. The 16th century closed not with the rise of an island nation destined to forge a global empire, but with its submission to a Catholic juggernaut. And as the bells of Rome rang in triumph, the rest of the world braced itself for centuries of Iberian dominance. By the dawn of the 18th century, the world forged by the Armada's victory had settled into a grim new order. Spain, though strained by the cost of occupation, still stood at the pinnacle of global power. England, once poised to become a maritime challenger, had been transformed into a loyal Catholic vassal, its monarchy replaced with a puppet dynasty sworn to Madrid and to Rome. The English Channel, that narrow strip of water once seen as a moat of safety, had become instead a bridge of Spanish dominance, guarded by fleets that ensured no rebellion within the island could hope to find foreign aid. Without an independent England, the very architecture of global politics warped. The great rivalries that defined our timeline, the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the balance between Bourbon France and Hanoverian Britain, the struggle for dominance in the Atlantic, never came to pass. The Dutch, crushed after the loss of their English ally, saw their mercantile empire dismembered. Their ports, once vibrant centers of trade and tolerance, fell under Spanish control. Amsterdam did not rise as the financial heart of Europe. The innovations in banking, stock exchanges, and credit that fueled capitalism in our world were smothered or absorbed into Madrid's slower, more centralized system. France, meanwhile, rose in prominence, but always in Spain's shadow. Freed from English hostility, the Bourbon monarchy expanded in North America and the Caribbean, but its efforts remained cautious. Paris knew well that Spanish fleets dominated the seas and that any French overreach risked Madrid's wrath. The French crown therefore focused inward, tightening its absolutist grip, crushing its Protestant Huguenots with renewed vigor, and reinforcing Catholic orthodoxy. In our history, France became a laboratory of Enlightenment thought. In this alternate timeline, it remained a citadel of monarchy, its philosophers fewer, its ideas slower to spread. Across the Atlantic, the absence of England changed everything. The eastern seaboard of North America, where in our world colonies like Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York sprouted, remained empty of English settlement. Spanish missions crept northward from Florida, while French traders pushed from Canada, meeting in a continent dominated by Catholic powers. The 13 colonies never existed. There was no Boston Tea Party, no Continental Congress, no Declaration of Independence. The United States of America, the democratic experiment that would one day reshape the globe, was never born. This absence altered the trajectory of the modern age. In the 18th century, when revolutions began to shake the old order, their echoes were muted. In our world, the American Revolution inspired the French. In this one, there was no America to ignite that spark. France, weighed down by Catholic orthodoxy and lacking the model of English constitutionalism across the Channel, found it harder to imagine liberty. The great upheaval of 1789 might still have come, but its scope was diminished, its ideals muted. Without America as both example and refuge, the French Revolution burned shorter, its republican flame stamped out more swiftly by the armies of Spain and its allies. Industrialization, too, slowed. In our history, the mills of Manchester and Birmingham, fueled by coal and innovation, launched an economic revolution that transformed the world. But in this alternate timeline, England's potential was shackled. Its inventors censored, its merchants absorbed into Spain's rigid system, its capital drained into Madrid's coffers. The Industrial Revolution might still have emerged, in Paris perhaps, or in the Rhineland, but later, weaker, more tightly bound to monarchs. Progress came not as a wave of liberation, but as a tool of empire, reinforcing the power of kings rather than undermining them. By the 19th century, Spain remained vast but brittle. Its empire stretched across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, but cracks widened. Local revolts simmered in Mexico, Peru, and Buenos Aires, inspired not by English or American ideals, but by desperation under the weight of taxation and central control. These uprisings, lacking a powerful Protestant example abroad, unfolded differently. Some were crushed, others won concessions, but none birthed a liberal democracy. Instead, new kingdoms and Catholic principalities arose. tied by blood and treaty to Madrid and Paris. The Americas remained Iberian in tongue, Catholic in faith, and monarchic in structure. The global balance of power never shifted toward the Atlantic in the same way. There was no British Empire to dominate India, no Pax Britannica to enforce free trade, no global spread of English law and language. Instead, the world of the 19th century was a Spanish-French duopoly, their empires sprawling yet ossified, their institutions authoritarian, their horizons narrower. The English-speaking world, reduced to a province under Spanish control, contributed little to global politics. Its language never became universal. Its parliamentary traditions never seeded new nations. The ideals of liberty, industry, and democracy, which in our world crossed oceans, remained smothered beneath Catholic crowns. And so, as steamships plied the oceans and railways snaked across continents, the world that emerged bore the unmistakable mark of the Armada's triumph. Europe remained the core, its monarchs unchallenged, its empires vast, its revolutions rare and stunted. The future belonged not to free peoples or democratic experiments, but to the long arm of kings and priests. Yet beneath this heavy order, murmurs of change still stirred. Resistance had not vanished, only been delayed. The ideas of freedom and conscience, though denied an English voice, might still reappear in some other land, in some other century. But for now, the shadow of Spain stretched across the globe, and the English dream of empire was nothing more than a tale of what might have been. And so, our journey through this alternate history reaches its end. We have walked the battlefields of Kent, seen Spanish banners rise above London, and watched the Protestant flames sputter into embers. The story of the Armada's victory is not merely a tale of ships and soldiers. It is the unraveling of the very fabric of the modern world. One storm, one battle, one twist of fate, and history becomes unrecognizable. In this imagined timeline, Spain did not limp home in defeat, broken by English cannon and North Sea storms. Instead, it triumphed. Elizabeth's fragile kingdom was crushed, her crown torn away, her experiment in Protestant defiance extinguished. England, rather than becoming the seed of a global empire, was remade as a Catholic vassal. Its navy was shackled, its merchants absorbed into Madrid's orbit, its parliament silenced beneath the weight of absolutism. The English language, instead of becoming the lingua franca of the modern age, remained provincial, confined to an island whose destiny was stolen. The ripples spread outward. The Dutch rebellion collapsed, the Reformation dwindled, and the Counter-Reformation surged like a tide across Europe. Rome stood vindicated, Philip II exalted. The Enlightenment came slower, dimmer, filtered through Catholic monarchies wary of heresy. The Industrial Revolution arrived not in Manchester or Birmingham, but decades later in Paris or Vienna, under stricter control. The age of revolutions was muted. There was no American experiment, no Declaration of Independence, no constitution to inspire oppressed peoples across the globe. The United States never existed. Instead, the world of the 18th and 19th centuries belonged to Spain and its Catholic allies. The Americas remained Iberian, their revolts birthing new monarchies instead of republics. The Atlantic was no crucible of freedom, but a highway of empire, its trade routes guarded by fleets flying the cross of Burgundy. The great ideas of liberty, democracy, and limited government survived only in whispers, delayed by centuries. Imagine our own world without the English-speaking empires, without Shakespeare's words echoing across continents, without Newton's laws guiding science, without America's rise reshaping the 20th century. The cultural, political, and technological DNA of modern civilization would be altered beyond recognition. Spanish might be the dominant tongue of international diplomacy. Catholic monarchs, not parliaments, might dictate the rhythm of history. The ideals we take for granted, freedom of conscience, checks and balances, representative government, might have emerged far later, or not at all. And yet, even in this grim alternate reality, the human spirit would not be extinguished. Somewhere, in some forgotten corner of Europe or the New World, voices would still rise against oppression. ideas of liberty might still flicker to life, perhaps centuries later, carried not by English exiles, but by other dreamers in other lands. History bends, but it never breaks completely. Still, the cost of the Armada's victory would have been immense, delaying the dawn of the modern world, chaining generations beneath crowns and crosses. This is the power of contingency, the terrifying truth that the world we know balances on fragile moments, a storm in the channel, a fire ship drifting toward the Armada, a single cannon shot finding its mark. These small threads of chance wove together the tapestry of our reality. Had they been cut differently, everything, our languages, our nations, our freedoms, might have been transformed. So now the question returns to you. Would you want to live in that world? A world where Spain triumphed, where Protestantism was crushed, where America never existed, and where liberty was delayed for centuries? Or do you prefer the uncertain, turbulent, but ultimately transformative history we inherited? The world where England survived, where the Armada failed, and where new nations rose from the embers of defiance? What do you think after hearing this story? If this alternate world chills you, or fascinates you, let us know in the comments below. Do you believe history was shaped by providence or by chance? And if you enjoyed this journey through the storm of 1588 and its possible consequences, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more voyages into the what-ifs of our shared past. For history is never fixed. It is a sea of possibilities, its tides shifting with every choice, every chance, every storm. And sometimes, in those moments when the wind changes, the fate of the world itself is decided.